The German air defense system was a marvel of mid-century engineering, a truly formidable barrier against Allied attack. It was known ominously as the Kammhuber Line, named after its creator, General Joseph Kammhuber. This complex network stretched across the Western European coastline, patiently waiting for the inevitable British night raids. The system was not merely a string of anti-aircraft guns. It was an integrated, guided defense. At its core were sophisticated radar systems that gave the Luftwaffe a revolutionary edge in the darkness. British Bomber Command initially faced horrific losses, with entire crews vanishing into the German-controlled night sky. The odds seemed hopelessly stacked against the fragile metal shells carrying their devastating payloads. Every move, every turn, and every altitude change of the RAF bombers was tracked with chilling efficiency. The German defenders felt an almost complete sense of security provided by their electronic eyes. They had built a digital wall that seemed impervious to destruction or, more importantly, to deception. This feeling of invulnerability permeated the entire command structure, from the scientists to the frontline pilots. They genuinely believed they had solved the problem of night defense for the remainder of the war. Their radar was considered a technological dead end for the British, a challenge too complex to overcome. This unwavering German confidence would soon become their single greatest vulnerability in the coming electronic war. The very foundations of their defense were built upon a flawed premise of electronic invincibility. Every night, the crews of the RAF faced the horrifying prospect of meeting this perfectly organized defense. Loss rates often climbed to unsustainable levels, threatening the continuation of the entire bombing campaign. The British realized that brute force bombing alone would never be enough to win the air war. A radical, almost desperate solution was needed to neutralize the threat that radar posed to their operations. The battle was not just being fought in the skies over Germany. It was a silent war of physicists and mathematicians. Victory would not go to the side with the most planes, but to the side with the most cunning electronic trickery. The stage was set for a dramatic, revolutionary turning point that nobody in the Luftwaffe could ever have predicted. Two primary German radar systems formed the unwavering backbone of the Kammhuber Line defenses. The first was the long-range Freya radar, which could detect incoming bomber streams from vast distances. Freya provided early warning and a rough vector for the defenders to begin their preparations immediately. It was the electronic alarm clock that roused the night fighters and the anti-aircraft gunners into action. The second, and far more lethal, system was the Würzburg radar, which operated at a much shorter range. Würzburg was a highly accurate, target-tracking radar capable of locking onto a single bomber with deadly precision. It fed essential fire control data directly to the ground-based anti-aircraft batteries for precise shelling. It also guided the dreaded Luftwaffe night fighters, leading them straight to their unsuspecting victims. These two systems worked in perfect, terrifying synchronization, creating overlapping fields of electronic vision. The Freya alerted the defense, and the Würzburg provided the final, fatal guiding hand for the attack. German radar operators became adept at interpreting the distinct, clear blips that moved across their screens. The signals were so pure and reliable that they rarely questioned the fidelity of the electronic image presented to them. This reliance on the visual clarity of the radar screen bred a sense of scientific certainty in the defense. They understood the principles of radio wave propagation and believed they had accounted for all possibilities. The very idea of a simple, effective countermeasure seemed like an almost laughable impossibility to them. They had invested years of scientific talent and immense national resources into building this electronic superiority. To their minds, any attempt at jamming would be either too complex to deploy or easily filtered out by their equipment. The wavelength and power of their systems were believed to be intrinsically protected from crude interference. This technological hubris allowed for a critical blind spot in their defensive planning and strategy. They never considered the simplest, most elegant solution could completely dismantle their entire architecture. The Luftwaffe's success had been built on this flawless electronic vision, and that very success contained the seeds of its destruction. The RAF knew they were fighting a battle of attrition against a perfect defense, and something had to give way. They were searching for a weakness in the German scientific certainty, a flaw in the physics they thought was absolute. The core of the Luftwaffe's defensive certainty lay in the pronouncements of their top-tier scientific minds. German engineers had studied the physics of radar and came to a definitive, confident conclusion about jamming. They determined that the sheer amount of power required to generate an effective jamming signal was practically impossible. A bomber would need to carry an enormous, heavy transmitter just to interfere with a single ground-based radar unit. To jam the entire Kammhuber line simultaneously, the logistical challenge would become utterly insurmountable. Their calculations proved that the British would never be able to fit such massive, power-hungry equipment into their aircraft. Therefore, the threat of wide-scale radar deception was scientifically dismissed as a fantasy or a bluff. This dismissal was so complete that countermeasures and anti-jamming research were given very low priority within the Reich. This critical scientific blind spot became a central, fatal flaw in their entire defense doctrine for the air war. The belief that the enemy was bound by the same technical limitations created a dangerous, false sense of security. They thought the British must adhere to the rules of physics as they interpreted them, which was a grave error. What the German scientists failed to account for was the elegant simplicity of a passive, rather than active, jamming solution. They were focused entirely on powerful radio frequency transmitters as the only mechanism for electronic interference. This focus meant they overlooked the possibility of a purely mechanical, non-electronic countermeasure. Their intellectual arrogance prevented them from considering a low-tech, genius solution to their high-tech problem. The idea that mere strips of metal foil could mimic the radar signature of a large bomber seemed absurd. A key figure in this dismissal was German General Wolfgang Martini, the head of the Luftwaffe's signals intelligence. Martini was convinced that any serious jamming attempt would simply be too slow and too inefficient to pose a genuine threat. His confidence was shared by the majority of the German High Command, who rested easy under the radar's electronic watch. This collective scientific complacency effectively shielded the German defense from preparing for its most existential threat. It was a classic example of complex thinking overlooking a devastatingly simple and obvious tactical solution. The entire fate of the Luftwaffe's night defense was sealed by this single, unwavering, and incorrect scientific conviction. They were about to be blindsided by a simple physics trick they themselves had deemed unworthy of serious attention. The Royal Air Force's Bomber Command was suffering a steady, debilitating, and unsustainable hemorrhage of aircraft and aircrews. In the early years of the war, German night fighter tactics proved frighteningly effective against the bomber streams. The efficiency of the Kammhuber Line meant that a large percentage of every raid was doomed to failure. These losses were not just statistical. They represented the constant death of highly trained personnel and expensive machines. The psychological toll on the surviving crews was immense, knowing their chances of survival were diminishing nightly. The British High Command understood that this rate of attrition could not continue without collapsing the entire bombing campaign. They needed a way to penetrate the electronic wall without having to resort to an impossible technological arms race. Directly matching the power of German radar with a more powerful jammer was clearly not a feasible option for the RAF. The priority became finding a way to blind the German electronic eyes completely, rather than just confuse them. Something was urgently required to level the playing field and restore a measure of protection for the air crews. The pressure mounted relentlessly on the scientific and technical branches of the British military establishment. Scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, or TRE, were tasked with finding a radical solution. Their research into German radar physics began to reveal the critical weakness in the German assumption of superiority. They focused their efforts not on active electronic jamming, but on the properties of the radar signal itself. The solution lay in manipulating the echo, the very signal that returned to the German operators' screens. This quest for a defensive edge led to a concept so simple it had been almost universally overlooked. The desperation of the situation fueled the willingness to consider even the most unconventional forms of attack. Every failure of a bomber raid only intensified the desperate need to deploy a game-changing countermeasure. The entire strategic direction of the air war hinged on the ability to silence the German radar network. The very morale of the RAF depended on finding a way to ensure the bombers could actually reach their targets and return. The scientists understood they were not just developing a weapon, but a shield for thousands of young airmen. The solution, once found, would represent a victory of ingenuity and desperation over powerful, confident engineering. This quiet, desperate research effort was about to deliver one of the most significant tactical breakthroughs of the war. The true secret weapon was conceived and developed in the quiet, unassuming research labs of the Telecommunications Research Establishment. This facility, known as TRE, was the epicenter of British electronic warfare and radar innovation during the war. It was here that the initial, almost accidental discovery of radar interference was translated into a deployable weapon. Dr. R.V. Jones, a brilliant scientific intelligence officer, was central to recognizing the potential of this discovery. He theorized that a cloud of reflecting material could mimic the radar signature of a massive formation of aircraft. The material needed to be perfectly tuned to resonate with the specific operating frequencies of the German Würzburg and Freya radar systems. The core of the problem was determining the exact length and shape of the foil strips to maximize the radar return. The calculations had to be precise, ensuring the metal strips acted as half-wave dipole aerials for the enemy radar. Initial experiments involved simple things like tinsel and tin foil dropped from test aircraft over the North Sea. These early trials proved the theory beyond a shadow of a doubt. The radar screens were instantly obscured by noise. The scientists officially codenamed the simple device Window, a deceptively innocuous name for its terrifying purpose. It was not complex machinery or a high-power transmitter, but merely countless bundles of cut aluminum foil. The creation of Window was a triumph of applied physics and brilliant, lateral thinking by the British scientists. It was a classic example of asymmetric warfare, using a low-tech, simple tool to neutralize a high-tech system. The knowledge that they possessed such a potent electronic countermeasure was tightly guarded at the highest levels. Only a select few individuals within Bomber Command and the scientific community knew of its true, devastating potential. The secrecy was maintained for years because the device was a double-edged sword that Germany could easily copy. The longer they waited to use it, the greater the advantage they would gain when it was finally unleashed. This scientific invention sat on the shelf for an extended period, awaiting the critical moment for its maximum impact. The tension between scientific readiness and strategic necessity was a constant, internal debate within the RAF command. It was a weapon that could change the war, but only if its first use was completely overwhelming and decisive. Window, the world-changing electronic countermeasure, was surprisingly and brilliantly simple in its physical form. It consisted of millions of thin, narrow strips of aluminum foil or aluminized paper, cut to precise lengths. Each individual strip was carefully cut to half the wavelength of the primary German Würzburg radar frequency. This specific, calculated length made the strips resonate violently when struck by the incoming radar wave. The resonance meant that even a tiny strip of metal could reflect a disproportionately powerful radar echo. When dropped en masse from a stream of bombers, these countless strips created a massive, chaotic cloud. This cloud of metallic reflectors instantly created a false, colossal echo on the enemy radar screen. The appearance on the German Würzburg screens was not a small blip, but an impenetrable, overwhelming white smear. This massive, false target completely masked the actual, smaller radar returns of the attacking RAF bombers. The individual aircraft became entirely invisible to the operators who relied on clear, crisp targets. The German fire control systems, dependent on a clean signal, were instantly rendered useless and blind. This passive deception required no onboard power and no complex electronic circuits within the bomber itself. The bundles of foil could be carried by a single crew member and simply tossed out of the aircraft's flare chute. The elegance of Window was in its exploitation of a fundamental, unchangeable law of physics. The German scientists had focused on the difficulty of overpowering their radar. The British merely obscured it. A single bomber could carry enough strips to create the illusion of a full squadron, multiplying the deception. The effect was not a mild confusion, but a total system collapse for the German radar operators. They were staring at a screen of pure electronic noise, a blinding snowstorm that offered no tactical information. Window completely invalidated the entire operational concept of the integrated Kammhuber Line defense system. The most advanced electronic defense in the world was defeated by a cheap, easily mass-produced commodity. It was the ultimate proof that superior technology is meaningless if it cannot see the simplest trick. Despite its undeniable effectiveness, the deployment of Window was intentionally delayed for nearly 2 years by British leadership. The delay was not due to technical issues, but to a profound, high-stakes moral and strategic calculation. The British feared that once they used Window, the Germans would immediately reverse engineer the simple trick. The moment the Luftwaffe understood the principle, they would have the capability to manufacture and use it themselves. This meant the Germans could then deploy their own chaff against British cities, blinding the RAF's night defenses. The potential for retaliatory German bombing raids to become catastrophically effective was a terrifying prospect. Churchill and the War Cabinet were deeply reluctant to greenlight a weapon that could be turned against their own civilians. There was a genuine moral dilemma concerning the ethical consequences of unleashing this electronic genie from the bottle. The decision was a terrifying trade-off: save the lives of thousands of RAF airmen now, or protect millions of British civilians later. This constant internal struggle created a frustrating bottleneck for the scientists and the Bomber Command operational planners. The mounting losses suffered by the bomber crews over German targets eventually forced a reevaluation of the strategic risk. It became clear that the current loss rate was simply unsustainable, threatening the ability to prosecute the war at all. The scale of the military need finally began to outweigh the very real and immediate fear of German reprisal. Intelligence reports also suggested that German scientists were still fundamentally convinced that active jamming was impossible. This intelligence vacuum within the Luftwaffe provided a narrow window of opportunity for the British. They concluded that even if the Germans copied window, it would take them months to overcome their initial disbelief and deploy it. The strategic goal was to use the element of surprise to deliver a decisive, crippling blow to German morale and industry. The deployment had to be concentrated, overwhelming, and focused on a target of immense importance to justify the risk. The decision to finally unleash Window was one of the most agonizing and consequential choices of the entire conflict. It was a calculated gamble that the temporary electronic advantage would be worth the long-term, terrifying danger. The decisive moment for the debut of Window was meticulously planned and scheduled for the massive attack on Hamburg. The city of Hamburg was a major industrial center, a shipbuilding hub, and a symbolic target for the RAF. This operation, codenamed Gomorrah, was conceived as a coordinated series of devastating night raids in July 1943. The goal was to demonstrate the true, terrifying power of the electronic countermeasure in a single, concentrated assault. On the night of July 24, 1943, the first wave of RAF bombers crossed the European coastline, and the operation began. As the aircraft approached the edge of the Kammhuber Line, the first bundles of Window were deployed into the night air. The bundles were timed to be released at a precise altitude and interval to create a perfectly dense cloud. A dedicated corps of aircrews were tasked solely with flying ahead of the main force, saturating the German airspace with foil. They were the electronic vanguard, laying down a shimmering, invisible blanket of metallic chaos for the main bomber stream. The sheer volume of reflective strips released was staggering, quickly creating a false reality for the German radar. The German air defense was utterly oblivious to the revolutionary change that was unfolding high above them. They prepared their night fighters and anti-aircraft guns based on the established, predictable procedures of the past. The first signals operators at the Freya and Würzburg stations began to notice a terrifying, inexplicable anomaly. The screens were not showing clear blips, but a solid, overwhelming, and utterly baffling mess of electronic snow. For the first time in the war, the powerful German radar systems were completely and decisively blind. The defenders were looking at a ghost army, a colossal, phantom bomber stream that obscured the true attacking force. The RAF bomber crews, who had flown through hell for years, now flew in a strange, unprecedented silence. There were no searchlights locking onto them, and the flak bursts were random, unaimed, and harmlessly distant. The strategic gamble had paid off instantly, delivering an overwhelming tactical advantage to the attacking forces. Inside the German radar command bunkers, the unfolding scene was one of disbelief, terror, and mounting chaos. The seasoned radar operators, who had seen thousands of raids, simply could not comprehend what their screens were showing. The familiar, reassuring blips of the enemy bombers were replaced by an incoherent, blizzard-like expanse of white noise. The Würzburg sets, designed for pinpoint accuracy, were the first to fail completely, blinded by the resonant echo. Operators frantically tried to adjust their settings, assuming a massive equipment failure or a system malfunction. They checked their circuits, calibrated their antennas, and tried to communicate with neighboring sectors, all in vain. The voice reports coming in from the forward observation posts confirmed the horrifying truth. The sky was full of bombers. Yet, the ground-based electronic eyes remained stubbornly, uselessly blind to the actual location of the attack. The meticulously constructed Kammhuber Line, with its integrated communication and control, instantly dissolved into disorder. Night fighter pilots, who relied entirely on ground control to guide them to the targets, were left orbiting helplessly in the dark. Their carefully coordinated interceptions became impossible. They were flying blind in a sky full of electronic deception. The anti-aircraft gun batteries, stripped of their precision targeting data, resorted to firing random, desperate barrages. The resulting flak was scattered, ineffective, and only served to highlight the total paralysis of the defense. Senior Luftwaffe officers were immediately summoned to witness the unbelievable scene of their entire defense collapsing. The initial shock gave way to a chilling realization that the British had achieved what was deemed scientifically impossible. This was not a malfunction. It was a deliberate, sophisticated, and utterly devastating electronic attack. The silence on the German side was the most terrifying thing of all. The silence of a once powerful enemy now completely disarmed. The successful attack on Hamburg that night was carried out with minimal loss to the RAF, a staggering reversal of fortune. The Luftwaffe was left reeling, facing the fact that their electronic shield was now a worthless piece of metal. The feeling of impregnable security had been replaced by a sickening, sudden vulnerability to the night raiders. The initial deployment of Window during Operation Gomorrah was a military success of unprecedented magnitude. The sheer effectiveness of the countermeasure directly translated into a dramatic reduction in RAF bomber losses. On the night of the main attack, the loss rate plummeted from an average of over 4% to a mere 0.3%. This was an immediate, staggering change in the cost of conducting a bombing raid over a heavily defended German city. The ability to operate with such minimal losses allowed the RAF to commit more planes and deliver a heavier blow. The physical destruction inflicted on Hamburg was catastrophic, culminating in a devastating firestorm that engulfed the city. The success was not just about the destruction. It was a psychological and tactical defeat for the entire German military. It proved that the Allies could now penetrate German airspace virtually unopposed under the cover of electronic noise. The confidence of the German night fighter pilots, once sky-high, was shattered by the complete lack of guidance. Their most potent weapon, the ability to see in the dark, had been nullified by a few grams of aluminum foil. The anti-aircraft gunners lost their faith in their equipment, watching shells explode uselessly far from any target. The entire principle of the Kammhuber Line was invalidated in a single, shocking night of electronic warfare. The high command was thrown into an immediate, frantic scramble to understand and counter the new threat. They initially struggled to identify the cause, proposing wild theories about sophisticated new British transmitters. The sheer simplicity of the actual method was initially too embarrassing and too shocking for them to accept. Window bought the RAF crucial months of electronic superiority, allowing them to escalate the air war effectively. The night over Hamburg marked the definitive end of the German air defense's reign of electronic terror. It was a profound turning point, demonstrating the critical importance of electronic warfare in modern conflict. The age of confident, unchallenged radar defense was instantly and violently brought to a close by a handful of metal strips. The Luftwaffe's initial response to Window was characterized by confusion, disbelief, and desperate improvisation. The immediate reaction was to dismiss the effect as a temporary, high-power jamming attack that could not be sustained. It took time and a painful process of elimination for German scientists to realize the simple, passive nature of the threat. They correctly theorized that the British would not have risked the secret unless they were prepared for it to be copied. Once the principle of Chaff was confirmed, German labs began frantically developing their own version, which they called Doppel. However, the organizational and logistical hurdles to mass producing and deploying Doppel were immense. The shock of the Hamburg raids made immediate, reactive changes to the night fighter tactics absolutely necessary. One key tactical adjustment was the adoption of the wild sow, or wild boar, technique by new fighter units. This strategy involved the night fighters hunting visually over the illuminated target area, disregarding the useless radar entirely. Another countermeasure was the Zomsow, or tame boar method, which involved pilots searching for bombers near their home bases. These new tactics were bold, but they were desperate improvisations that placed the fighters at greater risk and were less efficient. They also started adapting their radar by introducing filters designed to ignore small, slow-falling objects like the foil strips. This filtering was partially successful, but it also reduced the radar's sensitivity, making small bomber formations harder to detect. The Germans even attempted to switch to entirely new, ultra-short wavelength radar systems that Window was not cut for. This radar transition required immense time and resources that the besieged German war machine could ill afford. Crucially, the Germans were never able to regain the tactical surprise that the RAF had achieved with the first deployment. Their attempts at a counterattack using their own Doppel against Britain were late, sporadic, and never achieved the devastating effect of Gomorrah. The window of electronic vulnerability for the RAF was brief and never led to the catastrophic losses the British had initially feared. The entire counter-effort was a game of catch-up, a desperate scramble to restore a defense that had been fundamentally broken. The introduction of Window represented far more than a single tactical victory over the German air defense system. It fundamentally shifted the balance of power in the European air war, creating a genuine strategic advantage for the Allies. The immediate, drastic reduction in RAF losses allowed Bomber Command to sustain and intensify its pressure on German industry. It directly enabled the success of future, massive deep penetration raids with far greater confidence and lower risk. The electronic warfare advantage proved to be just as important as the superiority in aircraft production or pilot training. Window forced the Luftwaffe to divert immense resources into desperate, belated countermeasure development and radar adaptation. This diversion of scientific talent and industrial capacity was a significant drain on the overall German war effort. The disruption of the highly centralized Kammhuber Line fractured the entire integrated command and control structure. German night fighter units were forced to operate in chaos, leading to inefficiency and confusion across the front. The psychological impact on the German defenders was immense, replacing confidence with fear and technological bewilderment. They realized that the British possessed a level of electronic sophistication they could no longer match or anticipate. The deployment of Window officially inaugurated the age of electronic warfare as a critical, non-negotiable component of modern conflict. It demonstrated that information superiority and deception could be as powerful as firepower in achieving military objectives. The Battle of the Beams, a hidden war of physics and signals, was won decisively by the side that dared to think simply. The technological genie was out of the bottle, and its legacy would influence every conflict that followed in the next century. Window, the humble strips of foil, ultimately did more than just jam a radar. It irrevocably turned the tide of the air war. It created a sustainable path for the Allied bombing campaign, which became an increasingly crucial component of the final victory. The Luftwaffe's belief in the impossibility of jamming was a scientific certainty that cost them dearly on every front.